Well, good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event hosted by the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm Professor of Public Policy at the University and Director of the Institute for Policy Research. And I'm delighted this evening to be able to host and chair this event on graduate underemployment and the post-pandemic labour market. And this evening, we're going to be discussing some new research we've been undertaking at the university on the issue of graduate underemployment, but setting it in the wider context of the question of social mobility through higher education, the relationship between higher education and further education, and changing patterns of graduate employment and the graduate labour market. And these are very live questions in policy terms. We've got a spending review underway. That spending review due to conclude at the end of October, which will allocate funding to different departments and within the Department of Education between further and higher education and other sectors, and a lively debate going on within the government and outside it about things like the level of repayment at which student loans get to be repaid, the nature of the tuition fee system, and the balance between funding for further education and higher education students. So there's a lot of substantive policy debate going on at the moment on these questions, and we hope through this evening's seminar we can contribute to those. I'm delighted to say we've got a great lineup for you this evening. I'm going to start with my colleague, Dr. Matt Dickson, who's a reader in public policy at the University of Bath, where he leads on our programme of research on widening participation in higher education and more broadly on education and the labour market. He'll be followed by Professor Sandra McNally, and Sandra is Professor of Economics at the University of Surrey and a Director of the Education and Skills Programme at the Centre for Economic Performance, and she's done a lot of work on evaluating government policy and schools FE labour market returns to education and training. And then Sandra will be followed by Dr. Andrew Ross, who's the head of widening participation in the Directorate of Undergraduate Admissions and Outreach at the University of Bath. So he's responsible for leading our access team at the university in outreach to schools and colleges and for creating the strategies that we need to implement, particularly in respect of the targets set by the Office for Students. And finally, we've got Professor Lee Elliot Major, who's the country's first Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter. And many of you will know of his work at the Sutton Trust over many years on questions of social mobility and access to higher education. And in this new role, he focuses very much on bringing theory to bear on practice as well. So talking a lot about what these things really mean for schools, colleges, and universities. So delighted to welcome Lee, Andrew, Sandra, and Matt. I've got a little bit of housekeeping to do before we start, which is just to say that your cameras, for those of you watching this online, your cameras and microphones will be switched off. And if you've got a question, just submit it in the Q&A function, and then I'll moderate those questions. When we've had our presentations, we've got time for Q&A, and I'll group them together and put them to our speakers, our panelists. The session's being recorded, so this is all being filmed, and we'll make it available later on. So if you want to watch this again in the future, you can do so. We'll have a podcast of it too. So that's just on the housekeeping. Thanks everybody for your time, and I'll start with Matt. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. I will just start sharing my slides. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, without further ado, thanks, Nick. This is, as Nick mentioned, going to be talking about some research that I've been undertaking at the university, along with my colleagues Michael Donnelly, Predrag Laztic, and Kalyan Kameshwara. And really, this question of graduate underemployment sits, as Nick said, in a much broader conversation about higher education, the role of higher education, further education, the relationship between the two, the entire kind of post-18 education and training landscape, and all the implications this has for social mobility. And that's before we even get to the kind of thoughts about how the pandemic affects all of these things. So I will talk about this, but we will then have a kind of broader discussion, because you can't talk about graduate underemployment without thinking about the broader HE/FE landscape. So just by way of context, as we can see on the graph here, the UK has one of the highest proportions of tertiary educated workers in Europe. More than 40% have tertiary education, and this is going to continue to rise, given that our higher education initial participation measure is now above 50%. So in 2018-19, we're up to kind of 52%. We see that's been increasing. There's a bit of a dip around the kind of £9,000 fee introduction, but we can see we've now continued back above the participation there was before that, and up to more than 50%. So given this degree to which people are going to higher education in the UK, this makes the UK relatively more vulnerable to graduate unemployment or graduate underemployment than other competitors would be. And to put the context of graduate underemployment in the UK alongside other OECD countries, see about a third of English or Northern Irish graduates are estimated to be underemployed. This is using figures from Francis Green and Golo Henseke's publication a few years ago, using the survey of adult skills data. You can see we've got a relatively high degree of underemployment compared to, if we look down towards the left, Germany, Sweden, you've got less than a fifth of graduates underemployed. And ONS data suggests that actually this has been increasing for those who graduated in looking in 2017, those who graduated before 1992, the figure is only about 20% are underemployed. For people graduating from 2007 or later, it was more like a third, although that could, that could be a phenomenon of graduate underemployment getting worse, or it could just be that, that was at one point in time. It could be that as you get older, you're less likely to be underemployed. But either way, those are the figures for the UK at the moment. And I mean, as I say, this sits in a kind of broader question about the returns to higher education and the implications of graduate underemployment. There's implications for graduates themselves in terms of lifetime earnings, their ability to repay student loans, even things like getting entry on the housing market, and impacts in job satisfaction and other domains such as mental health, and even timing of family formation, given that people tend to want to get into a career and start moving up the ladder, and that impacts on when people start having family. Implications for the government in terms of reduced tax revenue from low earnings, but also, as Nick mentioned, big discussion about funding of higher education. Continue to discuss this with the spending review, but the increase in the RAB charge for people if you're earning less money and paying less back of student loans. And there's big implications for society, the economy, thinking about the growth of the economy, the development of the economy, depending on the level of graduate labour, levels in inequality, but also just the perception of higher education within society, and a kind of potential for disillusionment with higher education, and the implications that then has again for kind of funding regimes, etc. So important motivation for looking at graduate underemployment. And there was a fairly large literature on underemployment, graduate underemployment, and the wage penalties, fairly well known, about 2% control, after taking into account age, gender, ethnicity, and job tenure, it's about 2% wage penalty. But what is less well known is the extent of the persistence of underemployment. So how much does early underemployment affect your later underemployment? And just to note, graduate unemployment has similar consequences. We're going to see that later on, but is much less of a phenomenon. Only about 4% of undergraduate degree graduates from 2017-18 were unemployed 15 months later, according to the latest HESA data. And in our data, we find something similar, that at 42 months, only less than 3% are unemployed. So I'm going to get onto the question of our research and the findings in a second, but just to say something about the data. So we're very fortunate to have this linked data set from the Destination of Leavers from Higher Education. The longitudinal version has since been replaced by the Graduate Outcome Survey, but the longitudinal version takes people who were followed up 3.5 years post-graduation in the 2016, and we link that back to the 6-month Delhi survey. So people who in 2012-13, 6 months out of their degree, and then we link that back to the HESA student record. So this backward linkage means that we have, for everybody in the longitudinal version, we have all the information at each time point about their experience 6 months post-graduation, and also their information about their degree. So we've got great data, about 100,000 graduates. Majority are undergraduates, and but we do have some master's student PhDs. We're going to focus on undergraduate degrees here because that is where most of the debate is, I suppose, about the funding of higher education. It's like, yeah, for undergraduate degrees. We're going to define underemployment using the kind of traditional underemployment definition, which is just taking the first 3 categories of the ISCO categorization of jobs, and they're going to be categorized as graduate jobs, and anything less than this is not a graduate job. We have looked at using other definitions such as a kind of skills-based definition. That this actually find it only changes about 2% of people move into a graduate job if we do use that alternative definition. So for consistency with most of the literature, we're going to use the kind of traditional approach. Okay, so what does graduate underemployment look like in our data? So just simple breakdown here. After 6 months post-graduation, amongst these undergraduates, of which we've got 67,000 in our data, about half are in a graduate job 6 months after graduation, but just over a fifth are underemployed. So they're in employment, but they're in a non-graduate job. And you can see that about 8% are unemployed. And if we fast forward 3 years later, we find that we've got now almost over 2/3 are in a graduate job. We've still got 14% who are underemployed, but the unemployment has dropped down. So we have initially 7.8%, and that's dropped down to 2.5%. So that's the kind of raw picture. We're interested very much in the transition. So how do people move from 6 months to 42 months? So I can show you that here. And just to flag up, so this is 6 months down the kind of rows here where people are, and 42 months after graduation where people are. And you can see that there's strong, along the diagonal, there's strong persistence here of people who are in a graduate job. So 80% of people in a graduate job at 6 months post-graduation are in a graduate job 3 years later. But for the underemployed, half of those who are underemployed at 6 months are moving into a graduate job by 3 years later. But there's a persistence here. 30% of those who are underemployed after 6 months are still underemployed 3 years later, and this is quite significant and quite a concern, because if you see, with the unemployed, some are moving into graduate jobs, some moving into jobs but are underemployed. But the persistence of unemployment itself is much lower than the persistence of underemployment. So that's something we're going to come back to shortly as we look at the actual results. So this is unconditional. This is just kind of basic crosstabs here. Okay, so I'm not going to go through. I don't think I've ever done a presentation without one equation in, so it had to be in there. But this is essentially the model we're going to run. We're looking at 42 months post-graduation, whether you're underemployed or employed in a graduate job. So this is amongst those who are employed. And then we're going to look at what people are doing compared to the default, which is in a graduate job after 6 months. Have a look at the effect of if you're underemployed, whether you're unemployed, whether you're inactive or doing further study. We're going to look at that relationship, and then we're going to start putting in controls to see the extent to which this is capturing previous characteristics, your higher education experience, so capturing the type of university that you go to, the broad subject area, your degree attainment, and then we'll also add in controls for prior educational attainment at school, so that UCAS tariff and whether people have done A-levels or not, because not everyone in the data has done A-levels prior to going to university. And we've got measures of socioeconomic background, whether your parents or at least one of your parents is a graduate, parental occupation, polar, and then gender, ethnicity, age, and country of domicile. So there were limitations to this. So we've got a rich set of characteristics, but we do have to assume that it's, once we control for those, we're soaking up differences between people. That's quite, an assumption. There will be things that are correlated with graduate underemployment at 6 months that will also then affect unobserved characteristics that will also affect your probability of being underemployed at 42 months. So it's not possible to distinguish between pure scarring effect of early underemployment on later underemployment, or whether it's just a selection of certain people are more likely to be underemployed at both points. However, with these control variables in, if there is a kind of particular characteristic, it's likely to affect your school and higher education attainment. So to that degree, we're going to soak that variation up. We can't interpret too much on the characteristics in the model, the background characteristics, because we think they're all going to affect your 6-month status as well as your 42-month status, but we can see the extent to which the 6-month status is picking up just these different characteristics of people, and then compare like with like and see how much the 6-month status affects your later status. Okay, so I want to just show very quickly just some characteristics of the people in the data by 42 months. The graduate jobs here in the first columns, you can see the gender, that 58% are female, and you can see the ethnicity breakdown here. But what I want to kind of reflect really is that the underemployed and the unemployed look more like each other than the graduate employed and the underemployed, both in terms of their demographics, but also if we look at their A levels and tariff scores, UCAS, you can see that those in the graduate job, as you might expect, more of them have done A levels than the underemployed or the unemployed. Particularly the UCAS tariff, you can see that, as we might expect, those in graduate jobs had a higher UCAS tariff going into university, but actually the underemployed and the unemployed are not that different to each other. And that's a similar picture when we look at family background. So again, underemployed and unemployed are fairly similar in terms of their parental background and their polar background, so the extent to which people in their local area were going to higher education. And similarly in their parental background, you can see that the underemployed and the unemployed look very similar in terms of what proportion are coming from families where their parents were in the higher managerial occupations. So that's one thing that's coming through, that the underemployed are actually quite similar to the unemployed in their characteristics. And we've got some, we can look at the characteristics of, in terms of higher education. Again, if you look, the underemployed, half as likely to have gone to a Russell Group university than those who are in a graduate job. But again, very similar between the underemployed and the unemployed. And again, as we might expect, those who get first class honours or upper second class, higher proportion of graduate job holders have got those top two degree classifications, lower proportions for the underemployed, but again, quite similar between the underemployed and the unemployed. So that's just a kind of descriptive picture, but it just shows the importance of taking account of these characteristics, because these things are clearly correlated with your outcome at 42 months. Okay, so I've got through to the actual results that I'm sure people have been wanting to get to by now. So this is just showing the coefficient on underemployment at 6 months compared to being in a graduate job at 6 months. So you can see initially the raw figure is a 29 percentage point difference in your probability of being underemployed at 42 months. So compared to someone in a graduate job, being underemployed at 6 months is a large increase in your probability of being underemployed at 42 months. As we add in controls, you can see that adding in the higher education and the prior attainment takes it down a little, and then adding in the background controls, but it's still 24 percentage point higher probability of underemployment 3.5 years after graduation if you're underemployed 6 months after graduation compared to someone who was in a graduate job. So it looks like a strong degree of persistence. Just to show you here that actually, so this is the coefficients as we add more controls in. Just wanted to reflect that here the unemployed effect at 6 months is exactly the same as the underemployed. You can see further study, this is, again, it's all compared to somebody who's in a graduate job after 6 months. So any other status increases your chance of being in an underemployed at 42 months, but it's underemployment itself and unemployment, very large effects, even after taking account of a lot of characteristics. And there are we've looked at some heterogeneity, looked at interactions between gender and ethnicity and the effect of being underemployed after 6 months. For women, there's a 5 percentage point higher penalty for underemployment than for men. And amongst different ethnic groups, there's a higher penalty for Black graduates, 5 percentage points. That's significant. Whereas for Indian graduates compared to white graduates, that's a lower penalty for underemployment. The others are all fairly similar and not statistically different to the effect for white graduates. So there is some variation. Just to wrap up before we hand over to Sandra, just to think about, well, what do we learn from this? I'm sure we'll talk more about the kind of policy implications, but we can see that there's a strong relationship between early underemployment and later underemployment. And even when we control for a lot of characteristics, higher education experience and prior attainment, family background, it's still a 24 percentage point difference. And what's really striking is that this is similar to the impact of being unemployed at 6 months. So as I said earlier, it's not clear that this is definitely a scarring effect, or it could be individual heterogeneity. But I think the fact that we find different effects for different ethnic groups and for women compared to men suggests that there is an element of scarring. It's not just that a particular type of person is underemployed after 6 months. And I'll say, yeah, we find greater effects for women and for Black and Black graduates, lower effect for Indian graduates. In terms of policy, it highlights the importance really of the transition from higher education to the graduate labour market. It's not enough to just get from higher education into a job, any job. It's very important to get into the graduate labour market. And in some ways, whether it's a scarring effect or whether it's a heterogeneity effect, the policy of increasing early attachment to the graduate labour market is going to hopefully work in the same way for both, by giving people that experience, and should hopefully reduce later graduate underemployment. The additional impacts for women and Black graduates highlights the need for tailored support from higher education institutions, particular groups of students. And I think Andrew will speak to that later on in his comments. And it's a challenge for career services and the higher education sector in particular, as I mentioned, the underemployment effects are as large as the unemployment effects, but the underemployed are a much greater proportion of graduates at 6 months than the unemployed. There's 3 times more who are underemployed. So actually, we've heard, thought about graduate unemployment, but graduate underemployment seems to be more of an issue. So I'll leave it there, and we'll pick up discussion and questions later on. But I'll hand back to Nick.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Matt. It's an excellent presentation of your research, and yeah, so policy questions there, particularly what universities can and should do for thinking about equality into the labour market of their graduates, and not just equality of access into university, given these persistence of these effects and the inequalities that graduates experience. Sandra, I'm going to come over to you now. Sandra McNally.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, let me say thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words here today. So following on from what Matt was talking about, we can see that having a university degree is no guarantee that you're going to get a graduate job and not be underemployed. And he's also said that there's a lot of graduates. It's true that it's been growing, the number of people going to tertiary education. So one issue is, do we have too many graduates? And what are the available post-16 and post-18 pathways? If you're one of the minority of people who do vocational education at a higher level, maybe instead of a degree, what would your returns look like? And then finally, what are the implications of the changing economic environment? So to start with, just a picture of OECD, some OECD countries. And the bottom bar shows the percentage of the working age population who have at best below upper secondary education, so GCSEs. And the middle bar shows people who have got at most A levels or BTECs or level 3 qualifications. And then the bar to the right that shows the percentage of the working age population with tertiary education, which in the case of England and Northern Ireland is usually an undergraduate degree. And you can see from that, first of all, most people still don't have tertiary education, so it is something of a privilege to have it. England is not out of line with other OECD countries and is below the United States, Canada, Israel, Singapore, a number of countries. So it's not that relative to the OECD countries, there are far too many tertiary people. And we also have quite a lot of people who don't even get to A levels or equivalent. And that's actually a higher number than the OECD average and is particularly bad in Northern Ireland. So we do have problems here. We have problems getting people to progress between levels. And there's also quality issues because it's very hard to do international comparisons when the quality of education on offer and sometimes the years of education on offer differs within those levels as well. The next slide shows what our post-16 routes in England look like. I'll just talk you through this. This represents a whole cohort of people leaving their GCSEs. At age 16, the red bar shows people with good GCSEs and the pink bar shows people with bad GCSEs. Now, if you want to progress, your probability of progressing is much higher with good GCSEs, and that gets you to the yellow bar, which is a full level 3 qualification, and that's usually the prerequisite to go to university. There are some people from level 2 who manage to get to level 3, but it's a minority, whereas far more people who do well at GCSEs get there. And then from there, there's a very big route to university degree. So for people who do good GCSEs, the obvious thing to do is to get to A levels or maybe BTECs as well, and then get to the degree. It's still the case that by age 20, most people, the vast majority of people are not entering university. So not 50%, not 40% below that. The tiny green dot in the middle is level 4, level 5. These are higher national certificates, higher national diplomas. Many people will never even have heard of them. And that's what's our vocational higher level education in England. So very, very small numbers of people do that. There's more people who enter the labour market and then come back and do that. But even then, even when you count them in, that's not very many people and would compare very unfavourably to places like Germany. So what about these level 4, level 5 qualifications? What is that? Well, at level 4, the common qualifications are higher national certificate in engineering or in building and construction. That's very male dominated. And at level 5, the very common qualification is DPHE in nursing, which is very female dominated. And what do the earnings differentials look like? Well, what we've done is we've looked at people who have level 3, so A levels or BTECs, and they have that at age 18 and they have good GCSEs. And we look at what they do later. And then we, in terms of their, what do they do, level 4, level 5, level 6 qualifications, level 6 is university degree. And then we look at their earnings at age 30. This is using administrative data. The blue bar, this is just for women now, just shows the earnings differential. So a person with a level 3 qualification earns on average, I can't see it now, £19,600. If you get level 6, which is university degree, you'd be earning £8,000 on average more than that. So it's obviously much better to have a university degree than to stop at A levels. Once you put in controls, that earnings differential reduces quite a lot, because people who do degrees are typically far better performing at school than people who do anything else. So the bar comes down quite a lot. Other things compare very favorably to doing a level 3, to stopping at level 3, A levels and BTEC. So really, you know, one question is, why do so many people who have A levels and BTECs not go on to do at least level 4, level 5, 1 year or 2 year vocational courses? Because it looks as though they would have earned more and even sometimes done better than people with degrees by age 30 than if they just stopped. So that's a bit of a problem. It's a problem of revision. It may be a problem of incentives, a problem of information. And that's something that the government obviously would like to address. However, we have to bear in mind that it's not really a fair comparison in that level 6 contains a very broad range of people from creative arts to medicine, whereas level 4, level 5 is for a few, it is much more compressed in the types of subjects that people are doing. So if you replaced, for example, if you created lots of different courses at level 4, level 5 in areas that are not provided now, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a pattern like this. This is the same sort of pattern for men, and it gives you a kind of similar picture. You might think to yourself now, degrees on average are coming out less favorably, and that is true at this age. But bearing in mind the caveat I said about the subjects that people are doing level 4 and level 5 in, and that building and construction engineering are high-paying occupations for men at this age. It doesn't necessarily stay that way. It takes graduates quite a long time to settle into the labour market. If you are a graduate, you might get into management positions. There might be some progression there. And it might be, if you're doing a very specialist, have only a very specialist qualification, that those options might not exist. Or it might, if you have higher levels of qualifications, it may facilitate retraining, upskilling through your life in a way that vocational education may not give you. When people have looked at this across countries, so this is Eric Hanishek and colleagues who looked at vocational countries. I don't think the UK is in that. Apprenticeship countries, which are places like Switzerland, Germany, the places you'll know that have good apprenticeship systems. And it's true that people who do vocational education in these countries have an advantage early on in their career, but that does disappear later in middle age, and it is people with general education who are more likely to be employed later on. So this is a controversy, and we should definitely consider that when we're looking at things at a point in time, whether it be underemployment, whether it be earnings or employment, you have to think of people's whole life cycle and their whole trajectory. So what about the change in economic environment? Most analysis suggests that the demand for higher level skills will continue to increase, but this change isn't completely foreseeable in that, of course, we've just had the COVID pandemic, not foreseeable by most of us. We have things like climate change coming. You can see that to some extent, but what exactly it means for people's work is not that clear. So one of the things about an unclear future where higher level skills are more likely to be in demand is that people need to be adaptable and to be able to retrain and upskill throughout their life. But you can't do that if you don't have a good initial foundation throughout schooling, and if the support structures are not in place for retraining. So you do need to be able to finance your retraining and to have a second chance later. So the government have done something to address this. In my opinion, not enough, but might go back to that. Post-16 pathways can be very specialised, and is becoming more so because the government want to get rid of BTECs and make people do A levels or T levels post-16. That's potentially problematic. Vocational pathways are harder to understand compared to academic pathways, and less well integrated with the rest of the system, both in terms of what becomes before it and what becomes later. So sometimes people think of level 4, level 5 qualifications as instead of level 6, whereas in other countries there might be a bit more transition. So it's not that people would necessarily want to go from higher vocational to a full degree, but that possibility exists. And I think that's something that would be important to have in our system as well. There is a good case for more higher level vocational education within particular subject areas, but there needs to be plenty of general education within vocational education. So it's not really either or. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Sandra. That's great. Sorry, I'm just coming back onto my video. Thank you very much, Sandra. So that's really great to put the debate in the context of returns to different routes and what we mean by vocational education. So it's some really important data there. Thank you very much, Sandra. I'm going to now go to Andrew Ross from the University of Bath. Andrew.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for inviting me to present today. So I'm Andrew Ross. I'm the head of widening participation at the University of Bath. I haven't got any slides. I've got some notes in front of me. So I've got about 10 minutes, so I'll try and keep it quite brief. But I guess I'm bringing the practicalities to this. So I'm a researcher by trade. I did a degree and PhD in chemistry. I am one of these WP students that's gone on to, I guess, achieve in life. And I guess you could classify my job now as a graduate job. But the work that we do, I guess, is really about supporting students into and through and out of university. So I'm going to try and touch on those 3 bits over the next couple of minutes. So getting into university is an important thing. Making sure that students are in the right course for them will make sure that they achieve their potential throughout their degree, and will then help them to progress post degree. So choosing what's right is really important. And we know that students who lack that cultural capital, that live in those areas where very few people tend to go to university, they may be first in the family to go to university. They, like me, lack that understanding of all of the things that are available to them. They lack that sort of inherent knowledge about what is university and what are the courses and things that are available. So universities are trying to put in place a lot of support. Schools obviously do some. FE colleges and the like also provide a lot of advice and support, but as many of you on the call will well know, that cuts over the years to the amount of money that schools and colleges get has hindered the amount of advice and guidance that students can get, particularly around the careers advice. And it's really that careers advice that helps students. If they understand what they want to do before they go into a degree or whatever it is, so whatever point it is, point of GCSEs, A-levels, IB, whatever course they're studying at level 3, if they can understand what careers, what choices are available, they're going to make better choices throughout. So there's also the challenge of schools that are underfunded, or they lack that sort of equipment, that experiential stuff. So as a scientist myself, the thing I always come back to is the science lab kit. If you as a student have to do 12 set practicals, but the school that you're at doesn't have enough kit to be able to have that experience, you're not going to have the best experience, that best learning of that particular subject. You're less likely to choose that in the future. So those subjects that are more experiential, like the sciences, are going to be impacted by poorer schools and less quality teaching because of lack of funding. There's also that broader knowledge of the subjects that are available. So I think that comes into that cultural capital thing again. So particularly thinking about things like engineering, the sort of non-traditional subjects, those subjects that the students don't necessarily study in school, that you can't just sort of go, well, okay, I enjoy studying psychology, therefore I will go and study psychology at university. Those sort of subjects that are a bit more broader, that you sort of have to know about to be able to know about them, or at least know people that know about them and know how to access them. I think all that cultural capital stuff that affects students when they're choosing university affects their life and engagement throughout university, and it's the same sort of cultural capital, lack of knowledge and experience of playing the game, that then hinders them progressing after university. I know from my own experience that I didn't choose a university through the best way. I didn't know really how to experience university to the fullest to make sure that I was employable at the end. And after university, I definitely didn't know how to progress into sort of careers and what all that sort of stuff meant. So to address all of that, universities spend a lot of money through access and participation plans to work with schools, work with students, provide that information, advice and guidance to students, to schools, to teachers and to parents, to try and encourage them and support them with that decision-making process. There's also a program that the Office for Students funds called the Uni Connect Partnerships, which is also a similar sort of thing. It's about encouraging students into university. It's about supporting them with that knowledge, that cultural capital, and that ability to choose and engage. Matt mentioned in his presentation about transition, and that transition from degree or university into employment is really key. And that sort of that first 6 months is really important. I think that transition point is really important throughout everybody's experience. So schools are really focused on transition when they're talking from primary school into secondary school, when you're talking about Key Stage 3 into Key Stage 4, when you're talking about GCSE into A-level to university. At every transition point is really, really important. And I think whatever transition point you're at, if you don't set up the students in the best way, they're going to be hindered for that period of time, if not further on beyond that. So in terms of what we do as a university at Bath and as a sector, it's about making sure that students transition the best that they can into university. So there's lots and lots of support, particularly that's been put in place during the pandemic to support students to transition to university. So this incoming cohort that are just starting now are those students that didn't have their in-person GCSE exams. So we're very aware of how much experience in-person teaching, education that has been lost, and universities are putting in place lots and lots of additional support to be able to help students make a successful transition, so that they're not spending their sort of first few weeks and months of their term really struggling with that transition, and then that then hinders their first and final year outcomes. The biggest thing to support that transition is really sort of feeling supported as a person, and that wraparound support that we put in place. And financial support is really important for those most disadvantaged. So universities put in place bursaries and scholarships that allows students to be able to partake in things beyond just the academics. It means that they don't necessarily have to go out and work as much to be able to afford to live. They have some money in their pocket, so they can engage with the extracurricular activity that's available throughout university. So going through university, we've got to make sure that all students have a good experience and have a good time at university, and all universities will have some level of process and engagement for all of those things. But throughout that, we need to make sure that we're focusing on all students. So there's a big focus on universities around things like racism, bullying, isolation, mental health. It's really important that we look at all of those things, we identify all of those students, and we support all of them. If a student is being bullied, they're not going to have the brain space and the capacity to be able to focus on their studies to their full ability to achieve their potential at the end of their degree. And if they're not achieving their potential at the end of their degree, they're less likely to be able to go on to the high graduate level employment that we would expect. So at Bath, we spend a lot of time preparing our students throughout their degree. So we build in employability skills. We have a program that is vertically integrated projects, which is effectively grouping students by subject and activity rather than necessarily by year group, which helps people build those skills that are ready for employment. And we also know that soft skills are as important, if not more important, than the knowledge that students leave with when they leave their degree. Knowledge of how to, I don't know, write a particular code in computer science can be taught, but the resilience, the confidence to try, the resilience to fail can't really be taught. And that's the sort of thing that industry seem to be looking for, certainly in the conversations that we've been part of. So the final thing, I guess, in getting students through university is the outcome gaps. So we know that there are degree outcome gaps based on students' background, their characteristics, I guess. So, for example, Black students get lower outcomes compared to white students, which if employers aren't aware of in the terms of when they're recruiting students, they're just going to be looking purely based on grades rather than the context with which those students come to their particular place. So there might be challenges with students who are getting lower outcomes that are then not going on to be employed to the level that they should based on their potential. The final thing is that transition point again, and making sure that we're supporting the transition into employment. And a lot of that comes about building things like networking skills, experience of what it's like to work. So things like placements, internships. I said careers support was really important at the point of transition from sort of GCSE, A-level into university, all those sorts of things. It's even more important at this point. So we provide dedicated support, and many universities do along the same sort of lines, where we're identifying students who need that additional support, putting in place where we can one-to-one advice and guidance to help the students make the best decision for them. And the final thing is that we provide support after students have left the university. So they're part of a community, they get networking sessions, they're allowed to be supported. So making sure that that sort of cultural capital, that sort of inherent knowledge of how to navigate the system is provided and supported wherever we possibly can. Our most disadvantaged students, so the final thing I'll say actually is the most disadvantaged students at the University of Bath are our gold scholars who are on a scholarship program, and we have a dedicated support program for them when they're at the university. They take part in lots of things that is about this sort of building the cultural capital, building the knowledge, understanding how to network, how to navigate the system, all of those things that are inherent in some people who are maybe more affluent or maybe more from worlds where they're used to engaging with people in businesses and understand how to navigate the system. So we try our best to provide all the tools and skills for the students to best make the decision for them, rather than necessarily that everybody should go into a graduate job, but it's all about the individual student and making the best decision for them. And on that, I'll stop talking.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. And I think what you've presented there shows just how much effort and activity goes into these processes, right from, as you say, all the way through to after people graduate. So thank you very much for giving us all of that picture of that effort and why you do what you do. Our final contribution is from Lee Elliot Major. So Lee, Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks everyone. I just want to offer some comments, firstly about, I guess, the future prospects in all these dimensions, in terms of social mobility, in terms of the socio-economic gaps that are going to affect both education and employment over, well, probably the next decade or so. So I want to say a few words about that and my own research there. And then I'm going to offer some sort of responses and hopefully some provocative sort of policy implications of some of the things that everyone has said. So in terms of social mobility, my research with Steve Machin and Andy Isles at the London School of Economics is pretty clear on this. And we've looked at, in terms of estimating what the implications of income mobility are for young people growing up today, we essentially look at both the gaps in the inequalities in education and the inequalities in employment. You basically put those two things together and you come up with some broad estimates of what's going to happen in terms of the chances of, if you like, climbing that income or social ladder. And what we find and what we are finding is profound divides in terms of the learning lost over the year or so of the pandemic, whether we're talking about schools or indeed colleges or universities. And we're also finding that there is a strong socioeconomic gradient in unemployment and cuts to wages and being on furlough for those who are under 25 in particular. So, so I'm afraid, in terms of prospects, even before the pandemic, we were really entering what I was calling a dark age of declining opportunity. So absolute social mobility levels were already in decline. That essentially made it harder for young people to earn as much as previous generations or get on the housing ladder, et cetera, which many people will have experienced. But the pandemic certainly will have exacerbated and exposed those inequalities that were already there. Sorry to depress you all on this evening, but I think that's the context for all this. And our estimates range from about 5 to 20% decline in overall sort of social mobility levels. I think that's going to affect whether we're talking about unemployment or underemployment of graduates. I think it's going to affect the vocational offerings that Sandra was talking about, and certainly the access to university that Andrew was covering. A few comments on each of those presentations, all really interesting, and then perhaps some starters for sort of policy debates. I thought, Matt, your presentation really interesting. I think it's really important that when we discuss these issues, that it's not a binary divide. I mean, often people think of unemployment or employment, and that really was interesting to me, that there is this, big issue of underemployment for graduates. I wonder whether that will increase in the pandemic. My question, we'll come back to this, was what was the socioeconomic gradient for that? So was it that poorer graduates were more likely to be underemployed? It was fascinating seeing the persistence over that, and it really reminds me of when we ever talk about social mobility, you're looking at cumulative impacts throughout a life course, and sadly, tragically, it's always those from disadvantaged backgrounds that seem to fall further behind at every transition, right from pre-birth all the way up to post-graduation. So anyone who's serious about social mobility has to think about that life course and interventions throughout the life course, and indeed looking at inequalities as well. I think what's really interesting to me in all these debates, actually, is how much this is about work and policy, and how much this is about education policy. We tend to revert back to the responsibility being on higher education or schools. It'd be really interesting to know which graduates, what sort of pay they're on, in terms of how you define that underemployment, and maybe we need discussions about minimum pay and conditions for people. It'd be interesting to know, maybe Matt can come back to us on what level of pay and conditions these young people are on. I think one of the dangerous, in my view, implications of all that research, of course, is prioritizing certain aspects of higher education. And one of the things that I get a lot now in discussions is a pushback on how we define success. So some people say to me that they're not particularly interested in high earning jobs. What they want is a decent job. They want to stay in the region they're from, and they want a decent life. So I think there's a bit of a, in social mobility debates, we have to be careful about how we define success. So some thoughts there. Sandra, as ever, absolutely fascinating. And I wish we could spend as much time generally in policy debates, in terms of well over half people don't go to university. My question there, so again, was I wondered what the socioeconomic background are of those who go on to do level 4, level 5 vocational qualifications. I'd be fascinated by that. In terms of, and that to me was one of the biggest challenges, bigger challenge than tertiary education or access to universities in many ways. How do we promote more progression to level 4 and 5? Again, I'd be interested in views on how much is that about the workplace policies and whether companies are providing the resources to do that, and how much is that about the education system and what it's prioritizing. Just one sort of anecdotal thing on this, I have 2 teenage children, one age 18, one age 16. It's, I still live in North London most of the time, so maybe this is a small example of this, but the cultural expectations around what success means are very strong among young people, and that still predominantly is about going to a university, particularly going to a sort of Russell Group type, it's a highly selective university. And it's really interesting observing young people, many of whom actually would be better off actually doing a non-academic route. So I think you're right about information, and we know that parents still don't know that many of the vocational routes actually, in terms of earnings, are just as good as degrees. But I just still come back to that sort of cultural issue that I think it's changing slightly. I call it the sort of dinner party question for parents. Will you mention it? Most parents will proudly mention if their child is going to a top university degree course. Would you mention it if your son or daughter was doing a vocational level 4 or 5? I still think that's an issue in terms of certainly middle class culture. Be interested in views on that. And then finally, Andrew, fascinating. I love the fact that you had a holistic approach to widening participation access. I think that's really important. I think we're sort of possibly heading towards a perfect storm for university access. We've got incredible, as our research has shown, significant learning loss. And as you say, many young people who've missed out on large chunks of the curriculum, grade inflation, which seems to be advantaging those at the higher socioeconomic levels, so those who are more likely to get those higher grades. So it's harder for universities to perhaps provide more contextual offers. I think there's growing skepticism among this government about the use of contextual offers. I think there's an argument that says we should be sorting out these gaps within the school system. Easier said than done, of course. So I'll be interested in views on that. I think one of the other dangers will be number caps if we cap the student numbers. So I worry, again, sorry to be sort of pessimistic, but I do have fundamental concerns. The one thing I'd say about on policy, and I'll stop here, is the thing that I've learned from being in a university is universities, like lots of institutions, are driven by the metrics on which they're measured. And my view is that we need social mobility rankings for universities, and these would measure how many young people you get in from more disadvantaged backgrounds or more unrepresented backgrounds, and then the progress they make in terms of whether they graduate, and perhaps even what sort of jobs they get. So maybe you'd amend the current league tables which dominate university behaviour. My view is if you don't attack that, then it's going to be really hard to incentivize universities to do the things that they hopefully would want to do. And again, that comes back to the theme, I guess, of my theme here is how much is this the responsibility of universities and how much is it about the workplace? And I think that's a theme that runs throughout all these presentations. So I'll stop there. I could talk for much longer on it all. I hope that provides you with some interesting points to debate. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Lee. Some fantastic comments there, and some questions actually to our panelists as well in what Lee said. And we've got questions as well in the Q&A. Thank you, everybody who's watching, who's put a question in. And I think we'll run for about another 15 minutes, so we'll try and get as much as we can of the debate in. I just want to pick up on, I'll just start with some of those questions, and then perhaps when Matt and Andrew and Sandra come back, you could address some of the things that Lee has put to you specifically, these questions of class origins, for example, that Lee raised, some of these issues about whether we should have metrics for universities in this area, Matt, and how far. I think one question that probably runs through quite a lot of this is how far it's the responsibility of employers, particularly when they're recruiting from universities, not to unconsciously or otherwise discriminate against graduates from particular backgrounds and so on. So how much of this is about labour market discrimination, and how much is it about what happens in a university and what happens when they leave university? But just to start on some of the questions, Lee, I take it our first question actually was by email, which was to say, has the Kickstart scheme had any effect on the graduate labour market? So everybody knows about the furlough scheme during the pandemic, very, very big investment in keeping millions of people attached to their employers, keeping 80% of their wages paid. We've had a Kickstart scheme for young people. I suspect we probably haven't got much data on that question yet, and it's probably quite hard to know. But the implication of what you say is that actually lots of these inequalities that we entered the pandemic with have intensified, and therefore, if there have been government measures, they haven't addressed that problem.
Yeah, I mean, Sandra might know more on the actual sections, but my understanding is we just don't have enough data yet on things like Kickstart. I mean, I do welcome those sort of initiatives because we should at least pilot and then review them, because as you were sort of speaking to, I think we should look at that as much as we tend to come back to education policy to solve all these issues. So I welcome that move, but I think as ever we're going to have to see if they're actually working. But I don't know, the others might want to come.
Yeah, Matt, did you want to?
I just to say, yeah, I think the Kickstarter, we don't have the information yet, but I do know that the DWP are evaluating it as we speak. Probably right now, there's and in fact an IPR colleague, Sue McGuire, was part of the team, I think, who's evaluating the Kickstarter program. So I think we don't know at the moment, but we will know fairly soon.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm just trying to keep up with the questions. There's one question. We've got a couple from Tina Skinner, colleague of ours in the university, asking about intersectionality, Matt, in your data, and then also to Andrew asking about this kind of question of cultural capital and mentoring. You can probably see that in the Q&A, Andrew. But Matt and Andrew, do you want to take those two questions of Tina's, and then I'll come to Sandra?
Yeah, so just very briefly, thank you for the question, Tina. And yeah, absolutely. So we've done a bit of the intersectionality analysis, so looking just initially at women compared to men, and then looking at different ethnic groups and looking at how the penalties. And actually, this comes to something that Lee mentioned as well about, you know, socioeconomic gradients, and we do see that. So we do see the impact of coming from families with, say, routine occupation background has a higher probability of being underemployed at 42 months, and it's the kind of grade, you know, you just see it from compared to the top background, you just see a kind of fairly linear progression. But what we haven't done actually is looked at whether we could make a measure of socioeconomic, a single measure that we could then interact with the graduate underemployment at 6 months, just to see whether, okay, so we know that there's a more severe impact of underemployment at 6 months for women than for men. We know that there's a more severe impact for Black graduates than white graduates. It might be that not only are you more likely to be underemployed at 42 months if you're from a lower socioeconomic background, but actually the impact of underemployment at 6 months might be higher. So that's something, yeah, that we are. Yeah, there's a lot of questions to carry on addressing with this data, and it is very good data. It doesn't actually, I think you mentioned as well, Lee, about whether we have the earnings data. So this is more of a kind of complement to, you know, we think about the Leo data, which are obviously very good earnings information. What we do have with the Delhi data, the advantage is that we have a lot of occupational information, so we can certainly dig into that to see what the underemployed are doing. And also another, I'm not going to try and answer all the questions in one go, but another question I think mentioned about job satisfaction and, you know, broader measures of what we think of as success, and there's certainly measures of job satisfaction in there. So it might be that, you know, some underemployment will be voluntary underemployment, and we can have a look at whether people do report high or low levels of satisfaction, which will give some window on whether they're choosing that employment or whether it's something, you know, they would rather be in a different graduate job.
Great, thanks, Matt. Andrew, can I come to you?
Yeah, so I think this question was around mentoring and whether the university offers mentoring for students of low cultural capital, I guess, however you would define that. Yes, mentoring is important and is a great help to students. At the university, we do provide it at all levels. So we provide mentoring with our current students, mentoring potential students. Our current students get mentoring from older students can get mentoring from alumni. Alumni can then become mentors or be mentored by other alumni. So yeah, it's a really important part and actually can be really supportive as long as it's done in a positive way and matches people with similar backgrounds and similar interests. And then you start to get real insight and really supportive things. Just to respond to some of the things that Lee mentioned earlier, I share your skepticism and concern around this sort of perfect storm of things. The example that always springs to my mind is the digital divide. So there was this massive digital divide there before the pandemic. The pandemic hit, highlighted this massive problem. Nothing's been done. We're going back to the world we were before, where things get mitigated against by the education system. So I think you're right in that, yeah, like the education system gets blamed for a lot and mitigates a lot, and there's other things that government policy should probably be looking at. And on your point about metrics, I also agree in that universities are purely focused on league tables and metrics and things. My concern with that is that if you set your metric as proportion of students getting first or whatever it is in terms of outcomes, you're missing that added value and you're missing that potential and whether a student has met their potential, which is the same sort of things that schools struggle with, this sort of progress 8 and things that have been for many years. And how we manage that, I think if we could find a way of identifying, have you supported student from point X to point Y and have they achieved their potential, then that would be a brilliant metric to be able to measure, rather than purely on outcomes, because I think then you start gaming things, and that isn't as good.
Thank you, Andrew. Sandra, there's some questions also here. I mean, Lee, I think, was asking about the kind of social class origins of people who go into level 4 and 5 vocational HE. And there was also some questions in the chat about, in the Q&A, about whether, you know, what's really going on here is that the graduate labour market isn't able to sustain the levels of graduates that we're supplying into it, that we've got these persistent levels of underemployment. And that indeed, that by placing too much emphasis on the supply of skills and education into the labour market, we place insufficient emphasis on industrial strategy, employment support, the sorts of things that might themselves better structure the labour market so that it can use high levels of skills and so on, and maybe as well level 4 and 5. I wonder if you could perhaps touch on some of those points.
Yes, thanks very much. Well, to start with, we did not look at who goes to level 4, level 5 by SES group insofar as I can remember. We did look at the GCSE distribution. The people who do level 4, level 5 qualifications are very like the people who have level 3 qualifications by age 18. People who do university 3-year undergraduate degrees are on average higher performing at school. So one puzzle to me was, well, how come more of these 18-year-olds aren't deciding to do 1 or 2 year courses? And that should be a policy objective as well, to get more of people doing those things, because they're clearly in demand. The pay is quite good. So why are more people not doing that? Yeah. I agree with you about the cultural issue. We are as a country very interested in degrees, and it does come across. And cultural issues are very slow to change. But I would say there are structural issues to do with the provision of how come there isn't more level 4, level 5 provided in universities and in colleges. And there are structural issues to do with that. For example, they haven't been treated on a level playing field with degrees in terms of financing. Some of the things that you need to do level 4, level 5 courses are constrained, say, by the government. The things like medicine, nursing, that's something that's constrained by the government, or they require high capital investment. Things like engineering does. So there's some reasons why that hasn't been expanded more than it is. And then there's also issues about just information. I think if more people knew people who were successful through those routes, the cultural conversation might just change, as it does in other countries. The final issue about are we putting too much emphasis on the supply, what the education system supplies? I think possibly yes, because remember we have a big productivity problem. Productivity is lower in the UK than in other countries. We have a problem of management practices not being as good as in other countries. We have a problem of employers not investing in their workforce in terms of training. So there are that side of the market needs to be addressed, how you better utilize the skills that are available. So it's not that we should be producing less good people in terms of their education, but we should be thinking about the picture. You know, what does the whole economy look like? What does the labour market look like? And not try to approach it only from the supply side.
Great, thank you, Sandra. There's a couple of questions that are coming on. There's one from our colleague Sue Maguire, who Matt was mentioning earlier, and then an earlier question about degree apprenticeships, or I think refers to them as graduate apprenticeships. But obviously this is a relatively new development, degree apprenticeships. I just wonder if there's anything that, any data we have on their potential for widening participation. We have a colleague at the university doing a doctoral study on this question, that they seem to be positioned as allowing people to enter higher education through an employment-based route up to apprenticeship degree level, but at the same time it's employers who are acting as the kind of widening participation agents, if at all. So how do they sit in respect of this kind of challenge of access to HE, even if they're good at kind of employment outcomes, if you like, because people are employed on an apprenticeship. How do they relate to widening participation? I don't know, Matt, Lee, Randy, whether you've got any experience of that.
I'll quickly come in on this. I think Sandra was going to come in as well, but yeah, one University of Exeter, I have to shout about this. We do a lot of degree apprenticeships, which I really welcome. I think it's really good for universities. I think it's a good signalling, actually, that these things are treated seriously. The worry I have, and this comes back to, I think, a recent Sutton Trust report, was that there was some indications that because they are leading to good outcomes, the middle classes were starting to come in on that. And so one of the issues with social mobility, as you know, Nick, we've spoken about over the years, is that one, it's a zero-sum game, right? And I think doubly so now because public finances aren't great. So, if we could help Sandra here, if this was we'd have to take away something from HE, it seems to me. I don't think we're going to be able to do all. So I think there's some really difficult debates about this, but also it's a zero-sum game because there's only a certain amount of opportunities, as we're all talking about, unless you suddenly create more employment opportunities. And whenever you have a fixed zero-sum game, it seems to me that the middle classes will find a way. So my worry with degree apprenticeships is that they are, if you like, being exploited by the middle classes. But I'd be interested in other views on that.
Yeah, Sandra,
yes, higher apprenticeships account for an even smaller number of people than level 4, level 5. There's hardly any of them. Apprenticeships are much more common at level 3. And there's pretty good returns to them for some subjects, not for others. It's like degrees, it's like everything. It's very much influenced by the subject. I would say better value for money comes from investing in level 3 advanced apprenticeships and higher apprenticeships rather than degree apprenticeships from the public purse. Because I think degree apprenticeships are that bit more expensive. So in the mix, I would actually put more emphasis on lower levels of apprenticeship, and I think that would be better for social mobility as well.
Thank you, Sandra. Matt,
just to follow up the same, really. I think the research on the degree apprenticeships has shown that actually the backgrounds of the students taking degree apprenticeships are more skewed towards kind of middle classes than the general backgrounds of undergraduates more broadly. And I think our IPR research on this is Jane Mackay, our colleague, has shown that this is because of this, as Lee mentioned, this kind of capturing by middle classes of these routes for degrees, which are actually brilliant, because you're guaranteed into a graduate level job. You don't have the same fees and structure and debt and that sort of thing. So it's very attractive. And actually, there was initially a thinking and a policy thinking that this would be a route to widening participation for the obvious reason, because it leads to a graduate job and doesn't have the same costs. But that was never baked into the system, in that it's the employers who are deciding on who they recruit, and they don't have, whereas universities, as Andrew's talked about, very well aware of widening participation concerns, and it's, the Office for Students are very much on the case to make sure that we're doing everything we can. But for the employers, they just want to choose whoever they think is the best person for the job, and that is that's their bottom line, that's their incentive. And if you don't build something in to incentivize them to take social mobility and widening participation into account, then they don't do it. And so I think that as far as I know is what has happened. So this potential route for widening participation hasn't actually bore fruit, because it's not been designed in the way that it would need to be.
Great, thank you, Matt. I've just got one final question. We're coming to the end of the session, but it really relates to this point that's in your data, that that you've got. If you've gone to a private school, if you come from a background that enables you to go to a Russell Group university, your chances of being employed in a graduate profession and not being unemployed or underemployed are just much higher. And Lee talked about the kind of colonization of opportunity by the middle classes. And what do you say for those for policymakers? You're up against here something which is a powerful desire to reproduce the class position of your offspring, to ensure that they go to university, that not necessarily because of the education they'll receive, but they'll meet people at that university that give them networks and opportunities that when they leave university, they can get better jobs. They can exploit those connections and networks to get better jobs. And how much of this is what's really happening here, and how much of that's sort of feeding into the labour market experiences that people get when they leave universities, deliberate structures of reproducing class advantage. Lee, perhaps I can ask you that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you know, I've been looking at this stuff for many years, and you do start to become skeptical about the system, and exactly that it appears to be set up to replicate, you know, from one generation to another, the same social elites. All I can say is I think there has been over the last 10 years or so, you know, more focus on the vocational side. And I think I welcome that. I agree with Sandra, but I still don't think there's enough public money that goes, you know, to support those qualifications. I think we probably could level it up, if I can use that more. So I, you know, I mean, we could talk about university, and as you know, I've suggested randomization of slots in universities, or at least using contextual information. I think you have to have quite strong equalizing policies in there, but I think, or you also need to diversify opportunities. And so, but yeah, I agree with that. Unless you do that, you essentially are replicating the same elites. It'd be great, wouldn't it, to have a leader like you know, Merkel, who's just left, who was trained as a chemist, you know, who you know, and I just feel like if we had more people at the very top that came from these different backgrounds, then we would be, you know, hopefully that would then influence policy in a more fundamental way. I'll stop there. I could talk about that all night, as you know, but I'll hand it over to the others.
Great, thank you. Well, I just want to give Andrew, Sandra, Matt an opportunity just to sort of any final thoughts. Perhaps Andrew, I could go to you first.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, I'm happy to be Prime Minister, by the way, Lee, if you, as a chemist, as somebody from this background, you know, I can solve all those problems. So final thoughts from me, I guess, is that education has a big part to play in this, and that cumulative effect that Lee mentioned before about disadvantage just becoming perpetuated throughout. So I mentioned earlier about disadvantaged students going to poorer schools who then can't put in the teaching and the careers advice, which means that then they don't necessarily progress to their potential in level 3 and beyond. So I think there's a piece to play for education. I think that employers are starting to catch up, if that's a fair comment, to the universities, and universities being pushed to do contextual offers and contextualization of consideration and that sort of stuff. I think employers are starting to get there, but it's a lot further behind than the universities are. Great,
thanks very much, Andrew. And Sandra, and then perhaps I can ask Matt to wrap it up.
Okay, I suppose what I would like to see, many things I'd like to see, but I'd like to see better linkage between higher education at level 4, level 5, level 6, so that they're not really pitched against each other, because I think it can be part of a system. And it would be good to see things like credit transfer that was discussed in the Yoga Review, and better links between colleges and universities, and become a reality. And I do hope that's part of the plan. And I'd like to see more breadth as well, and apprenticeships as well. It seems sometimes it has the feeling that education post-16 for a lot of people can be quite narrow, and I think that's counterproductive, and I'd like to see that change too. So those are the things that would be on my desk if I were Prime Minister, which is very likely.
Great, thanks very much, Sandra. Matt, I'll let you have the last word.
Thank you. Yeah, I very much agree with those points, and I think the point about broader education is really key. And I think looking, as Sandra said, at the whole system of post-16, post-18 education and training, and I think not pitting HE against FE, but rather seeing these things as complementary routes, and not trying to always divide into vocational versus academic and vocational versus higher education, when actually a lot of higher education is vocational and high level vocational training. Universities are an appropriate place to be doing that, and that is what universities do a lot. So I think I would like to yeah, like to see a kind of a broader view, a more holistic view of the whole post 18 education and training system. And just slightly narrower on the transitions that Andrew mentioned. Yeah, I think our underemployment work just really highlights, again, we know about getting people into university and the importance of that transition, but again, the transition out, it needs a lot of focus as well. And just finally on the cultural point, I think this is the reason why we don't have such a broad view of the whole system, is that, yeah, with the social reproduction that Lee mentioned, a lot of policymakers, I think, don't have experience of the non-higher education system because, they've not been through it, their children aren't going through it. And so until we have, perhaps a broader base of people who are making these decisions and more experience, and then we might get a bit more attention on it, because I think you're right, Lee, when you mentioned about, the cultural issue, that people are almost, if your children aren't going to university, it's you speak quietly and you don't really mention it. So I think there's a broader, cultural point there around how we value different skills, and it's very appropriate, as we've seen in the past few weeks with different jobs where we suddenly have shortages of people, and a realization that we need not just people doing academic subjects, graduates. We need a broader base of high level training, and hopefully spending review will be something that can contribute towards positive moves there.
One final point, Nick, if I can just get in squeeze in there. I mean, one of the answers to your question is, and just following on from what Matt was saying, was we pay people higher wages for doing different jobs. So you pay lorry drivers more money, you give them better conditions. So that social replication argument goes alongside with increasing inequality, that we reward those jobs, certain jobs and not others. So one of the answers to it, and then you get talked about another debate, is addressing the profound inequalities that we face and will face even more post-pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely, Lee. And the question of how you compress the wage distribution, how you raise wages in particular occupations, really important points. And as you say, we've seen that starkly in the last couple of weeks over HGV drivers, lorry drivers, and what's happened to their paying conditions over the last decade or so, and where that's left us. So that very important point. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching this evening and enjoying the debate and contributing your questions. We will capture the Q&A, so that if we haven't answered those ones directly tonight, we'll have them, and we'll try to get back to you by email with answers to those. And of course, in the fullness of time, we'll put this up as a video, and Matt's research with colleagues will be published as well, so we'll be able to make that publicly available. But thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening, and thanks to all of our panelists and participants for their contributions this evening. And I'll see you again soon. Do stay in touch with the IPR, its work. We have plenty of more public events coming up, so stay in touch with us in the future. Thanks very much indeed.